All right, so the Truman Doctrine directly inspired the European Recovery Program, commonly known as the Marshall Plan, which was introduced on June 5th, 1947, by Secretary of State and former Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. The plan aimed to reduce hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos, and to restore the confidence of the European people in the economic future of their own countries and of Europe as a whole. Indirectly, the Marshall Plan aimed to turn back socialist and communist bids for power in Northern and Western Europe. The Marshall Plan, in effect, brought the 17 recipients of aid into a bilateral agreement with the United States. So these Western European nations ratified what was called the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades, also known as the GATT Treaty, which is still in force today, which reduced commercial barriers among member nations and opened all to U.S. trade. Considered by many historians to be the most successful post-war U.S. diplomatic venture, the Marshall Plan created the climate for a viable capitalistic economy in Western Europe. Industrial production in that region rose by 200% between 1947 and 1952. So we're looking at something along the lines of an economic miracle being generated by the United States. Deflationary programs cut wages and increased unemployment. But profits soared, and ultimately the standard of living in Europe improved. The Marshall Plan drove a further wedge between the United States and the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, basically decried the Marshall Plan as an American scheme or plan to rebuild Germany and incorporate it into an anti-Soviet bloc. There's a lot of paranoia in the Soviet Union about a regenerated and rejuvenated Germany. And their sort of, I guess what we would call their experience during World War II, I think gave them a good foundation for the paranoia of being scared of regenerated Germany. The president readily acknowledged that the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were two halves of the same walnut. Once the Marshall Plan was in place, the strategy of containment began to take clear shape in Germany. In June 1948, the Western Allies decided to incorporate the American, French, and British occupation zones into a single nation, the Federal Republic of West Germany. Stalin perceived this as yet another threat to Soviet security, and so on June 24, 1948, he responded by stopping all traffic to West Berlin, formerly controlled by the Western Allies, but situated, as we talked about in class, deep within Soviet-occupied East Germany. The Soviet retaliation created both a crisis and an opportunity for confrontation. With help from the Royal Air Force, the United States began an airlift of historic proportions, and there we're looking at one of the American planes in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. The United States began an airlift of historic proportions that delivered nearly 2 million tons of supplies to West Berliners. Finally, in May 1949, the Soviet Union conceded defeat and lifted the blockade. Within a few weeks, East Germany and West Germany were established as separate republics. The Berlin crisis made a U.S.-led military alliance against the Soviets attractive to Western European nations. And in April 1945, 10 European nations, Canada and the United States, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the organization called NATO, a mutual defense pact in which an armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all. NATO complemented the Marshall Plan, strengthening economic ties among the member nations by, according to one analyst, keeping the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. It also deepened division between Eastern and Western Europe, making a permanent military mobilization on both sides almost inevitable. So triumphant in Western Europe, Truman managed only a mixed record in Asia. The United States achieved its greatest success in occupied Japan. General Douglas MacArthur directed an interim government and a modest reconstruction program that included land reform, creation of independent trade unions, abolition of contract marriages, and granting women the right to vote, demilitarization, eventually constitutional democracy that barred communists from all posts. In return for its sovereignty, granted in 1952, Japan agreed to house huge U.S. military bases, thus replacing U.S. troops and weapons strategically close to the Soviet Union's Asian rim. The situation in China could not be handled so easily. After years of civil war, the pro-Western nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek collapsed. Chiang Kai-shek's troops were forced to surrender in mid-1949 to the communists, led by the very colorful guy on the slide here and subject of pop art and some very famous paintings by Andy Warhol, Mao Zedong. Mao enjoyed the support of the Chinese countryside, where 85% of the population lived. By the end of the year, the nationalist government had withdrawn to the island of Taiwan, leaving Mao the entire China mainland. Since World War II, the United States had sent military and economic aid to Chiang despite his unpopularity in China. American officials warned him that without major reforms, the nationalists were destined to lose the war. Moreover, they tried to convince Chiang to turn over the reins of government to a less corrupt group of moderates or to accept a coalition with Mao. But when Chiang Kai-shek insisted on fighting, the United States said, "Screw you, we're not going to be betting on a losing horse," so we broke off relations. The news of China's fall to communism created an uproar in the United States. The Asia First wing of the Republican Party, which envisioned Asia rather than Europe as a site of economic expansion, blamed the Truman administration for losing China and began to refer to the Democrats as the party of treason. After Stalin signed a formal alliance with Mao in February of 1950, the rhetoric of the Cold War became yet more pronounced. The perceived threat of international communism came to dominate American foreign policy for the next 20 years. The policy of containment depended on the ability of the United States to back up its commitments through military means, and Truman invested his faith in the U.S. monopoly of atomic weapons to pressure the Soviets to cooperate. The United States began to build atomic stockpiles and to conduct tests on the Bikini Islands in the Pacific, and by 1950, as a scientific advisor subsequently observed, the United States had a stockpile incapable of somewhat more than reproducing World War II in a single day. Despite warnings to the contrary by leading scientists, U.S. military analysts estimated it would take the Soviet Union 3 to 10 years to produce an atomic bomb. In August of 1949, the Soviet Union proved the U.S. military absolutely wrong by testing its own atomic bomb. There is only one thing worse than one nation having the atomic bomb, prize-winning scientist Harold C. Urey said, and that's two nations having it. Within a few years, both the United States and the Soviet Union had tested hydrogen bombs 1,000 times more powerful than the weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Both proceeded to stockpile bombs attached to missiles, inaugurating the fateful arms race that scientists had feared since 1945. The United States and the Soviet Union were now firmly locked into the Cold War. The nuclear arms race imperiled their futures, diverted their economies, and fostered fears of impending doom. Prospects for global peace had dissipated, and despite the Allied victory in World War II, the world had again divided into hostile camps. And the specter of a prolonged Cold War with the Soviet Union had encouraged many Americans, including the nation's leaders, to become obsessed with problems of national security, real or imagined, and to resort to extreme measures to solve them. Within a decade after World War II ended, a huge federal bureaucracy dependent on government spending and surveillance at home and abroad had greatly changed the relationship of the federal government to everyday affairs. The national security state is created. And shortly before World War II, the federal workforce totaled about 900,000 civilians, with about 10% engaged in security work. By war's end, the government employed nearly 4 million people, of whom 75% worked in national security agencies. The Pentagon, which had opened in 1942 as the largest office building in the world, housed the Joint Chiefs of Staff and 35,000 military personnel. The ties between the armed forces and the State Department grew closer, as former military officers routinely began to fill positions in the State Department and diplomatic corps. The National Security Act of 1947 laid the foundation for this expansion, and this is a really, really, really important act. The act established the Department of Defense and the National Security Council to coordinate and administer defense policies and to advise the President. The Central Intelligence Agency, and if you take my elective in the fall, you will learn a lot more about, with roots in the wartime Office of Strategic Services, was established to obtain political, military, and economic information from around the world. Although information about the CIA was classified, that is secret from Congress and the public, historians have estimated that the agency soon dwarfed the State Department in number of employees and size of budget. On March 21st, 1947, Truman signed Executive Order 9835, establishing the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, and this is a crazy program. The program barred members of the Communist Party, as well as fascists and anyone guilty of sympathetic association with either with either from federal employment. Later amendments added homosexuals as potential security risks on the grounds that they might succumb to blackmail by enemy agents. Many local governments enacted loyalty programs and required state and city employees to sign loyalty oaths. Nearly 10,000 people may have been fired as a result of loyalty programs. In 1950, Congress overrode the president's veto to pass a bill that Truman called the greatest danger to freedom of press, speech, and assembly since the Sedition Act of 1798. The Internal Security Act required communist organizations to register with the Subversive Activities Control Board, so this is even crazier now, and authorized the arrest of suspect persons during a national emergency. The Immigration and Nationality Act, sponsored by Republican Senator Pat McCarran of Nevada and adopted in 1952, again over Truman's veto, barred people deemed subversive or homosexual from becoming citizens or from even visiting the United States. It also empowered the Attorney General to deport immigrants who were members of communist organizations even if they had become citizens. Challenged repeatedly on constitutional grounds, the Subversive Activities Control Board remained in place until 1973 when it was terminated. Anti-communist Democratic Representative Martin Dees of Texas, who had chaired a congressional committee on un-American activities since 1938, told reporters at a press conference in Hollywood in 1944, "Hollywood is the greatest source of revenue in this nation for the communists and other subversive groups. Two elements stand out in the making of pictures which extol foreign ideology, propaganda for a cause which seeks to spread the ideas to our people, and the leftists or radical screenwriters." A few years later, Dee's successor, J. Parnell Thomas, directed the committee to investigate supposed communist infiltration of the movie industry. Renamed and made a permanent standing committee in 1945, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, H-U-A-C, had the power to subpoena witnesses to testify anywhere in the United States and compel answers on threat of contempt of Congress charges. In well-publicized hearings held in Washington in August 1947, HUAC found ample evidence of leftist sympathies, but none of the subversive activity it alleged. In 1947, the studios announced that no writer, technician, or actor who refused to denounce communism would be employed again, and HUAC encouraged testimony by friendly witnesses such as Ronald Reagan and Gary Cooper. The committee intimidated many who feared the loss of their careers into naming suspect former friends and co-workers in order to be cleared for future work in Hollywood. A small but prominent minority refused to cooperate with the investigators. And by claiming the freedoms of speech and association guaranteed by the First and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution, they became known as unfriendly witnesses. A handful served prison sentences for contempt of Congress. Meanwhile, a blacklist persuaded advertisers to cancel their accounts with many radio and television programs considered friendly to the Soviet Union, the United Nations, and liberal causes. The Hollywood blacklist remained in effect until the 1960s, effectively limiting the production of films dealing with social or political issues. In August 1948, HUAC opened public hearings with star witness Whittaker Chambers, Time magazine editor and former communist who confessed to spying for the Soviet Union during the 1930s. Chambers named as a fellow communist Alger Hiss, a veteran of Roosevelt's State Department, Roosevelt's advisor at Yalta, and at the time of the hearings, president of the prestigious Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. A federal grand jury in January 1950 convicted Hiss of perjury only for denying he knew Chambers and received a 5-year prison term. Many Democrats, including Truman himself, at first dismissed the allegations against Hiss, conveniently publicized at the start of the 1948 election campaign, as a red herring, a Republican maneuver to convince the public that Democrats had allowed communists to infiltrate the federal government. In 1954, Hiss was released from prison, still claiming his innocence. The most dramatic spy case of the era involved Julius Rosenberg, a former government engineer, and his wife Ethel, who were accused of stealing and plotting to convey atomic secrets to Soviet agents. The government's case against the Rosenbergs rested on the testimony of their supposed accomplices, some of them secretly coached by the FBI. Nonetheless, in March 1951, a jury found them guilty of conspiring to commit espionage. Around the world, the Rosenbergs were defended by citizens' committees, and their convictions protested in large-scale demonstrations. Scientist Albert Einstein, the Pope, the President of France, among many other prominent figures, all pleaded for clemency. not to have them killed or to reduce their sentence. The Rosenbergs maintained their innocence to the end, insisting that they were being persecuted as Jews and for holding leftist political beliefs. They both died in the electric chair on June 19th, 1953. And I'm sure you are familiar, at least in terms of name, with this figure. In a sensational Lincoln Day speech to the Republican Women's Club of Wheeling, West Virginia on February 9th, 1950, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin announced that the United States had been sold out by the traitorous actions of those who have been treated so well by this nation. These bright young men who have been born with silver spoons in their mouths, such as Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who McCarthy called a pompous diplomat in striped pants with a phony English accent, were part of a conspiracy, he charged, of more than 200 communists working in the State Department. McCarthy refused to reveal names, however, and a few days later, after getting really trashed, he told persistent reporters, "I'm not going to tell you anything. I just want you to know I've got a pail full of shit and I'm going to use it where it does me most good." Although investigations uncovered not a single communist in the State Department, McCarthy led a flamboyant offensive against not only New Deal Democrats, but the entire Truman administration, with failing to defend the nation's security. His name provided the label for the entire campaign to silence critics of the Cold War, McCarthyism. Behind a blitz of publicity, the previously obscure junior senator from Wisconsin had struck a chord. Communism seemed to many Americans to be much more than a military threat, indeed nothing less than a demonic force capable of undermining basic values. It compelled vigorous patriots to proclaim themselves ready for atomic warfare. "Better dead than red" was a big quote during this decade. McCarthy also helped form organizations such as the American Legion and the Chamber of Commerce, prominent religious leaders and union leaders. Civil rights organizations faced the severest persecution since the 1920s. The Civil Rights Congress and the Negro Youth Council, for instance, were destroyed after frequent charges of communist influence. W.E.B. Du Bois, a renowned African-American historian and famed concert singer, and former All-American football player Paul Robeson, had public appearances canceled and their right to travel abroad abridged. In attacks on women's organizations and homosexual groups, meanwhile, anti-communist rhetoric cloaked deep fears about changing social mores. Aided by FBI reports, the federal government fired up to 60 homosexuals per month in the early 1950s. Undesirable discharges from the United States Armed Forces for homosexuality and administrative procedure without appeal also increased dramatically. Even noted liberal historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. suggested that critics of the Cold War were not real men or perhaps real women either. Joseph McCarthy and his fellow Red Hunters eventually burned themselves out during televised congressional hearings in 1954. Not only did McCarthy fail to prove wild charges of communist infiltration of the army, but in the glare of the television cameras, he appeared deranged. Cowed for years, the Senate finally censured him for conduct unbecoming of a member. And so this brings us to the final phase of the Cold War, which is the end of the Democratic era. So we're talking about the end of the period ushered in by Franklin Roosevelt with his election in 1932, and which will go out with Harry Truman in the loss of the election of 1952. The Cold War tensions that fostered sort of the dark feelings in the United States. In terms of the United States, the Cold War years seem to many observers a time of great psychic stress. Popular culture registered these anxieties. There's something called the film noir period, which sort of exhibited itself during this decade. And this was a series of Hollywood movies that featured heroes or protagonists who are strangers or loners falsely accused of crimes. Also, Cold War anxiety manifested itself in a flurry of UFO sightings. Dozens of private researchers claim they had to have been contacted by aliens demanding that Earthlings cease atomic testing. So these Cold War tensions that fostered this cultural noir continued to fester in Europe and pushed the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of armed conflict during the Berlin crisis. Yet it was a conflict in Asia that finally transformed their political and ideological competition into a war threatening to destroy the world. For Truman, the Korean War proved political suicide. At the end of World War II, the Allies had divided the small peninsula of Korea, ceded by Japan, at the 38th parallel. Although all parties hoped to reunite the nation under its own government, the line between North and South hardened. The United States backed the unpopular government of Syngman Rhee, in the Republic of Korea, that's South Korea, and the Soviet Union sponsored a rival government in North Korea under Kim Il-sung. On June 25, 1950, the United States State Department received a cablegram reporting a military attack on South Korea by the communist-controlled North. If we are tough enough now, President Truman pledged, if we stand up to them like we did in Greece 3 years ago, they won't take any next steps. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, regarded the invasion as Kim Il-sung's affair. Despite Soviet disclaimers, Truman sought approval from the United Nations Security Council to send in troops because of the absence of the Soviet delegate, who could have vetoed the decision. Remember, we read about this in the United Nations sections. The Security Council agreed. 2/3 of Americans polled approved the president's decision to send troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur to South Korea. At first, military events confirmed the wisdom of the president's decision. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, had fallen to the north within weeks of the invasion, and the communist forces continued to push south until they had taken most of the peninsula. The situation appeared grim until Truman authorized McCarthy to carry out an amphibious landing at Incheon. With tactical brilliance and good fortune, the general orchestrated a military campaign that succeeded on September 15th, 1950, in halting the communist drive. By October, UN troops had retaken South Korea. And I guess if you look at this slide here, Incheon is just slightly left of the big star that represents the capital city of the South, Seoul. Basking in victory, the Truman administration could not resist the temptation to expand the war aims. Hoping to prove the Democrats were not soft on communism, the president and his advisors decided to roll back the communists beyond the 38th parallel. Until this point, China had not been actively involved in the war, but it now warned that any attempt to cross the dividing line would be interpreted as a threat to its own national security. Truman flew to Wake Island in the Pacific on October 15th, 1950, for a conference with MacArthur, who assured the president that the chances of China or the Soviet Union joining the war were very little. MacArthur had, however, sorely miscalculated. Chinese troops massed just above the UN offensive line at the Yalu River, and the Yalu River is that blue line on this slide at the top of North Korea, which divides China from Korea. Suddenly, without any air support, the Chinese attacked in human waves. MacArthur's forces were all but crushed, and the Chinese drove the United Nations troops back to South Korea, where they regrouped along the 38th parallel. By summer 1951, a stalemate had been reached very near the old border. Negotiations for a settlement went on over the next 18 months amid heavy fighting. MacArthur tried without success to convince Truman to prepare for a new invasion of communist territory. Encouraged by strong support at home, he continued to provoke the president by speaking out against official policy, calling for bombings of supply lines in China and a naval blockade of the Chinese coast. Actions certain to lead to a Chinese-American war. What Harry Truman did is he called for a meeting of General Douglas MacArthur, and finally on April 12, 1951, the two of them met at Wake Island, where Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination and other unauthorized activities. By instituting a peacetime draft, however, in 1948, and then ordering American troops into Korea, Truman had bypassed congressional authority. And Truman carefully referred to the military deployment not as a war, but as a UN-sanctioned police action. The president derived his authority from National Security Council Document 68, a paper adopted by the National Security Council in April of 1950. And this document, NSC 68, pledged the United States not only to drive back communist influence throughout the world, but also to foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet Union. Its use demonstrated, as one historian observed, a centralization of power in which the entire government had literally been compressed or consolidated into the presidency and his like-minded appointees. The Korean War, which permitted Truman to activate NSC 68, also provided the president with the public rationale for a rapid and permanent military buildup, including the allocation of at least 20% of the gross national product to national defense. By 1952, the U.S. Army had grown to 3.6 million people, or 6 times its size at the beginning of the conflict. At the same time, the federal government accelerated the development of nuclear bombs and weapons, including the first hydrogen bomb, tested in November of 1952. The outcome of the Korean War did nothing to improve Truman's case for rolling back communism. Negotiations and fighting proceeded in tandem until the summer of 1953, when a settlement was reached in which both North Korea and South Korea occupied almost exactly the same territory as when the war began. U.S. casualties topped 142,000. The North Koreans and Chinese lost about 2 million people. The war devastated the civilian population of both North and South. For the UN, troops had used both carpet bombing and napalm, destroying most of the housing and food supplies in Korea. True to the emerging pattern of modern warfare, the majority of civilians killed were women and children. Nearly 1 million Koreans were left homeless. For the United States, the Korean War extended the principle of containment far beyond Europe and enlarged the geographical range of the Cold War to include the Far East. The war also lined up the People's Republic of China and the United States as unwavering enemies for the next 20 years and heightened U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia. Moreover, the Korean War did much to establish an ominous tradition of unwinnable conflicts that left many American soldiers and civilians skeptical of official policy. There was only one burning issue during the election campaign of 1952, and that was the Korean War. And opinion polls indicated widespread frustration with Truman's conduct of the war. His popularity had wavered continually since he took office in 1945, but it sank to an all-time low after he fired McCarthy as commander of the United Nations troops in Korea. Congress received thousands of letters and telegrams calling for Truman's impeachment. "Oust President Truman," bumper stickers could be seen. McCarthy, meanwhile, returned home a hero, welcomed by over 7 million fans in New York City alone. Popular dissatisfaction with Truman increased. Newspapers reported that officials in his administration had been dealing in 5% kickbacks for government contracts. Business and organized labor complained about the price and wage freezes imposed during the Korean War. A late 1951 Gallup poll showed the president's approval rating at 23%. In early 1952, Truman announced he would not run for re-election, a decision rare for a president eligible for another term. In accepting political defeat and disgrace, Truman left the Democratic Party in disarray. The Democrats' best hope for victory now lay in convincing Dwight Eisenhower to run on their ticket. Although his reputation as a moderate conservative suggested no continuity of party traditions. When Eisenhower politely refused their offers, Democratic leaders turned to the popular but uncharismatic governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson. Admired for his honesty and intelligence, Stevenson offered no solutions to the conflict in Korea. Accepting the Democratic nomination, Stevenson candidly admitted that the ordeal of the 20th century is far from over, a prospect displeasing to voters aching for peace. The Republicans made the most of the Democratic's dilemma. Without proposing any sweeping answers of their own, they pointed to all the obvious shortcomings of their opponents. When opinion polls showed that Dwight Eisenhower possessed an unprecedented 64% approval rating, and when Ike allowed himself to be drafted for the Republican nomination, his triumph within the party was certain. Republicans had waited too long for a White House victory. Eisenhower styled himself the moderate. He avoided the negative impressions made by the unsuccessful 1948 Republican candidate Thomas Dewey, who had seemed as aggressive as Truman on foreign policy and simultaneously eager to overturn the New Deal domestic legislation. Eisenhower knew better. Voters wanted peace and government-assisted prosperity. He neither threatened to widen the war nor supported the stalemate created by Truman. He appeared firm but not confrontational. He promised to end the Korean War with an early and honorable peace, although he did not go into specifics. Meanwhile, Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate, a guy named Richard Nixon, waged a relentless and defamatory attack on Stevenson, calling him Adlai the Appeaser and the Ph.D. graduate of Dean Acheson's cowardly College of Communist Containment. The Republican campaign was itself not entirely free, though, of scandal. Nixon had been caught accepting personal gifts from wealthy benefactors. But Eisenhower, meanwhile, continued to enchant the voters as a peace candidate. 10 days before the election, he dramatically announced, "I shall go to Korea to settle the war." Eisenhower received 55% of the vote and carried 39 states, in part because he brought out an unusually large number of voters in normally Democratic areas. He won the popular vote in much of the South and in the northern cities of New York, Chicago, Boston, and Cleveland. Riding his coattails, the Republicans regained control of Congress. The New Deal coalition of ethnic and black voters, labor, northern liberals, and southern conservatives no longer commanded a majority. So, Dwight Eisenhower's election diminished the intensity of the Cold War mood without actually halting the conflict. The Eisenhower movement, wrote Walter Whitman, was a mission in American politics to restore a sense of community among the American people. In a larger sense, many of the issues of the immediate post-World War II years seem to have been settled or put off for a distant future. The international boundaries of communism were frozen with the Chinese Revolution, the Berlin blockade, and now the Korean War. Meanwhile, at home, Cold War defense spending had become a permanent part of the national budget, an undeniable drain on tax revenue, but an important element in the government contribution to economic prosperity. If the nuclear arms race remained a cause for anxiety, joined by more personal worries about the changing patterns of family life, a sense of security nevertheless spread. Prospects for world peace had dimmed, but the worst nightmares of the 1940s had ceased as well.